All right, this is great stuff. We are down to the final two, the first ever college football playoff national championship with Oregon taking on underdog Ohio State down at Cowboy Stadium. If you've been with us for the entire season here on Mark Rogers TV, every Tuesday night we line you up with all the previews and predictions of every top 25 college football game with Mr. Joe Lisi of GoForThe2.com. So we finish it off in grand style and do it the right way. We bring on Joe, and we're really going to break down the Buckeyes and the Ducks. How are you, Joe?
Doing great, Mark. Should be a great national championship game this coming Monday. Can't wait.
You know, before we talk about the Buckeyes and the Ducks, any obvious takeaways, anything in depth that you've got for us in regards to the Rose Bowl and the Sugar Bowl, anything that you came away with that maybe you didn't expect out of those games?
Well, obviously the dominating performance by Oregon in the Rose Bowl over defending national champion Florida State really surprised me about the margin of victory, 39 points. I understand it was due to turnovers, scoring off those turnovers in the second half. But for me, it came down to both Florida State and Alabama all year struggled with the turnover battle. Both of those teams were minus in turnover margin. Florida State at a -2 entering that game, and Alabama at a -1 entering the game against Ohio State. And both of those teams lost the turnover battle against Oregon and against Ohio State, respectively. And in big games, Mark, you need to be able to create turnovers and change field position. That's how winning teams do it. And both Oregon and Ohio State were able to do that, and Alabama and Florida State were not. And in my opinion, that is the real reason why the Ducks and Buckeyes are playing for the national championship game.
Okay, Joe, let's go personnel versus personnel, matchup versus matchup. Let's start with the Oregon offense against the Ohio State defense. The Ducks ran a play every 20 seconds in the Rose Bowl. They had a blistering pace against Florida State. It was obviously effective in scoring 59 points. Ohio State starts on defense with a talented front four that, for the most part, dominated and really got after Blake Sims and company. So start off with the Ohio State defense taking on that Ducks offense.
Well, I really think that this Ohio State defense statistically has the tools to really create some problems for Oregon and Marcus Mariota. When you look at their only loss on the year at home to Arizona early in the season, that Arizona Wildcat defense was able to create pressure, sack them 5 times, and really disrupt the timing of the offense, Mark. That's going to be the key for Ohio State if they win this ball game, is the defensive tackles. Can they create and get penetration against the Oregon offensive line? And I really do think that Joey Bosa and that defensive front have the ability and the speed to do that. They have 43 sacks on the year. They've created a lot of pressure already against some solid offensive lines throughout the season, including Michigan State. And I really think that this defensive front is the key to the Ohio State victory on Monday night. I really think that that's how you disrupt the timing. You push the offensive lineman back into the backfield the way Arizona did, create some pressure and collapse the pocket on Mariota, and that's the key to the Ohio State defense against the Oregon offense on Monday night.
Joe, everybody knows about Bosa, the All-American. Alabama paid a ton of attention to him. They kind of freed up the other side of the defensive line with Steve Miller. He had a big game. Who really impressed me in this game is Michael Bennett, who's going to be an NFL star, I believe, at defensive tackle. He was a serious impact player in the Tide's defensive backfield in this game. Adolphus Washington was a big recruit who has had a subpar career at Ohio State, but he's come on the last half of this season, played extremely well in this game. Oregon loves to spread it out when they distribute the ball in the passing game. They didn't have a 1,000-yard receiver, but they've got so many guys. When you look at Byron Marshall out of the backfield with 66 catches and 5 touchdowns, Darren Carrington at almost 20 yards per reception, 4 touchdowns. Devin Allen had 41 catches, 684 and 7 touchdowns. Dwayne Stanford's another guy that catches touchdown passes with 6. That Ohio State defense, as we've talked about for the last year, not necessarily the trademark Ohio State defense that you would expect at least to start the season, but maybe it is right now. The Silver Bullets playing up to their name. Von Bell has been a force in the defensive backfield, and Duran Grant, the big Buckeye concern defensively was handling Amari Cooper. And sure, he caught 9 passes, but he only averaged like 8 yards per reception. The Ohio State secondary really played well in this game.
They absolutely did, Mark. And you mentioned held them to 9 receptions, but they didn't give up the big play deep to Amari Cooper. They forced Blake Sims in that offense to methodically work down the field and really force Alabama to make the plays, and they weren't able to do that in the end. Blake Sims with some interceptions that led to points, and they put the pressure in the second half on that Alabama offense. That's the one key that we said going into the game that Ohio State could capitalize on, is that Alabama throughout the season really didn't play a complete game from start to finish against top 25 competition. Against LSU, they jumped up early, held on late, came on in the overtime victory. Against Tennessee, the same thing. Against Ole Miss, it was a first-half effort. Against Arkansas, they came on in the second half. So statistically, didn't have that complete performance, okay, against Texas A&M, but that was against a worn-out Texas A&M defense at that point. So outside of that game, Blake Sims and that offense struggled, and that's where Urban Meyer, the defensive staff, really capitalized in that game. And I think that this team really has the ability to really capitalize on Oregon. They're plus 10 in turnover margin, Mark, Ohio State, and 10 of their opponents on the schedule this year outside their game with Alabama were bowl teams. 6 of those teams won in their bowl games. So this is a battle-tested team defensively, and I think they match up very well in the secondary going up against Mariota and his weapons on Monday night.
You know, Joe, on the plus side for Oregon in this matchup, they bring in their starting center, really the leader of the offensive line, Haranis Grasu. He had missed some games dating back to a leg injury on November 8th. They brought him back for the Rose Bowl. He was key in the running game, as well as Thomas Tyner, who had missed some late games in the regular season. He comes back and runs for 124 yards against Florida State, coming off the shoulder injury, had 2 touchdowns, and of course Royce Freeman, as a true freshman, has just been a battering ram, so it should be fun to watch Oregon's running game against the Buckeyes front.
It really should be. I mean, defensively, I think that the MO and how you really have to game plan for Marcus Mariota and the Ducks offense, you mentioned it, they run a play every 20 seconds. They're going to look to run fast break football. Defensively for Ohio State, look for them to match up man on the outside, bump and run coverage, and utilize some blitz packages. I don't expect them to play zone and allow Mariota time to pick apart that secondary. I think they're going to play man-to-man coverage early, play bump and run, and look for Urban Meyer, defensive coordinator, to really blitz Mariota and put the pressure on that offensive line to pass protect, and we'll see if they can do it or not. But that game plan-wise, from a defensive perspective, that's what Ohio State has to do to have success.
All right, Joe, let's flip the script. Let's go Ohio State offense against Oregon defense. We both agreed going into the first the Wisconsin game and then the playoff game against Alabama that Cardale Jones has all the talent in the world. He can throw that thing through a brick wall. He showed it against Alabama. He can really throw the deep ball. And then once they got the running game going with Ezekiel Elliott, he found some crossing routes and really delivered the ball. The guy's 250 pounds, and he's got great speed for that size, and he's got the talent. What we questioned going into the Alabama game was when he faces adversity, whether it's from a game situation standpoint, down 2 scores in the third quarter, how's he going to respond, or from the standpoint of seeing more complex coverages out of Kirby Smart and Nick Saban and seeing a pass rush, how's he going to respond, and he answered the questions. So Cardale Jones seems to be much more of a known factor going into this game.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Mark. You're absolutely right, 100%. A big game experience gained against the victory against Wisconsin and against top-seeded Alabama last week. He has big game experience, and that should carry over to this national championship game. You look at Ohio State overall, this team has showed so much resolve overcoming Braxton Miller's injury, overcoming JT Barrett's injury, overcome the death of a teammate, and to then perform on a national stage in dominating fashion against a solid Wisconsin team and a solid Alabama team. You cannot take that away from the Ohio State offense or defense for that matter. Cardale Jones, I think if you're Urban Meyer and Herman, you still want to use short to intermediate passes. I don't think Ohio State, even though from an offensive perspective they're putting up a ton of points, I don't think you want to get into a shootout with Oregon. I think you want to methodically work down the field, get some ball controlled drives to keep Mariota and that offense off the field and win a game 30-27 in that area. You have to remember, Ohio State is 8-0 over Oregon all-time. Last victory came in 2009 against Jeremiah Masoli with Terrell Pryor at the quarterback position. A little bit different type of team led by Jim Tressel in 2009, more of a conservative attack. But take some recipe out of that game plan and blueprint. I think you have to really work down the field and keep that offense off the field, and that's the recipe to beat the Ducks in this championship game.
All right, Joe, you did it. You brought up the 2010 Rose Bowl, and I think that's a great example, and I'm trying to determine how different this Oregon team is than that Oregon team. The Ohio State team's different in the sense that they want to play fast-paced football to a certain extent, maybe not to the extent of Oregon, as you just mentioned. But in that game, and we've seen it over the last few years, and we've talked about it a few times, Oregon, one of the elite teams in college football. But when they run up against, in that Rose Bowl game, an Ohio State defense that featured a number of NFL players, so they didn't overmatch the team on the edge, and they also got beat up front. Then they faced LSU in a season opener. Same thing happened. Same thing happened against Auburn in the national championship game. Same thing happened 3 out of 4 years against Stanford. When a team could match them athletically in the speed game in space, but also had the superior bulk and muscle up front, that's when they struggle. Now, I think this Oregon team might be a little bit more equipped with the likes of Royce Freeman and a little bit more physical of an offensive line than it's been in the past, and maybe defensively a little bit more stout, and we saw that against Florida State, where plenty of those Florida State offensive linemen are going to be in the pros, but Oregon a little bit more staunch and stout up front than they used to be.
Great point. And also another point, Mark, is Florida State's defense this year did not create a lot of sacks. Entering that matchup against Oregon, through 13 games, they had 17 sacks on the season. This was not a dominating defensive front by the Seminoles. So when you look at this dominating performance in the Rose Bowl, yes, it was a dominating performance by Oregon, but when you delve deeper into the numbers, Florida State's defense was not what it was under Jeremy Pruitt in 2013. Just not the same type of defense. A drop-off by Mario Edwards, a drop-off by that secondary. You have to remember, the Florida State secondary in 2013 led the nation in pass defense, only giving up 156 passing yards per game. This year, they were over 200. So it's a different pass defense by the Seminoles. They were challenged each and every week. They were minus in turnover margin, and they were not solid against the run. So different type of defense that Oregon faced in Florida State. Now they're going to face a top 10 defense in Ohio State, in my opinion, that plays like a team and understands how to win and overcome adversity. So it's going to be a little bit harder and a different type of task, but we'll see if they can do it. It should be an interesting matchup and game plan.
Joe, as you well know, Ohio State's got a deep threat in Devin Smith, who's probably going to see 7-8 players on both sides of the field that are going to touch the ball more than he does, but he might have a greater impact on the game because every time he touches it, it seems to go for 50 yards and a score. In the last 2 games against Wisconsin and Alabama, 6 catches, way over 20 yards a catch, like 35 yards a catch, 4 touchdowns. For the season, just 32 receptions, 12 touchdowns, and almost everyone's a home run.
Absolutely. Devin Smith really came on. You can look at that Big Ten championship game performance, 3 touchdowns, 137 yards, receiving just a deep threat that can take the top off the defense. They're going to have to get him involved early against this secondary for Oregon. Oregon's secondary surrendering over 270 passing yards per game. Entering that game against Florida State, they were on the road or on a neutral field site. They were at 279 per game. Jameis Winston torched that secondary for 348 yards, so it's a higher number entering this matchup against the Buckeyes. But look for Urban Meyer, Herman to get him involved early in the passing game. I think if you're Cardale Jones, you want to get into a rhythm early as you develop the game plan, and then as you develop a lead. I think it's imperative, Mark, that Ohio State jumps up early, not only to take the pressure off of the offensive line, but to take the pressure off of Cardale Jones, because we still haven't seen him have to win the game solely on his shoulders. Can he do it? I think he's shown that he can, but it's really, realistically, only his third start as a starting quarterback. And for me, I want to see Ohio State jump up early if you're picking the Buckeyes, because I think if they fall behind Oregon in this matchup, that's a recipe for disaster.
You know, Joe, I have difficulty judging this Oregon defense. Yeah, they looked devastating against Florida State and Arizona the last 2 times out, but we're talking about an Arizona offense that struggled against, for the most part, until late in the game, struggled against Boise State, but more so than that, scored 7 points against UCLA. The Arizona offense, I don't think, is exceptional. Florida State struggled against the likes of Boston College and Florida, and we could go down the list. So Oregon did the job on defense. They lead the nation in plus turnover margin at 20. And, of course, they got the kid at linebacker who's an exceptional playmaker, Tony Washington, one of the best around. So what do you make out of this Ducks defense?
Well, I think turnovers are key. They've been able to, you mentioned it, they lead the nation with 20 turnovers on the year, that 20 in turnover margin. So that's a solid effort that leads the nation, and that's why they're in the national championship game. They've been able to create turnovers and, more importantly, score off those turnovers. So they're fast off the edge. Washington's a dynamic player. You saw what he was able to do last week. And realistically, they're going to put pressure on the Ohio State offensive line and force Cardale Jones to make reads in the game. But without Ekpre Olumu, I really don't think that they have the defensive weapons to really lock down Devin Smith. And I look for Ezekiel Elliott and Marshall to get involved in the offense and be utilized in different looks by Urban Meyer, and really Ohio State to confuse this Oregon defense. I just think it comes down to, what does Ohio State possess that Oregon hasn't faced yet? And to me, I think they possess weapons that come out in the backfield through Elliott, through in the passing game, Marshall, and fly sweeps. And I think that they have the coach in Urban Meyer that puts the ball into his playmakers' hands and knows how to win national championships with lesser talent, let's say. Let's look at 2006 with Chris Leak at the quarterback position for the Florida Gators going up against the Ohio State Buckeyes and Troy Smith. He found ways to pull out a game plan that really maximized his talent, and you have to give him credit. He's a big game head coach, and in my opinion, a slight edge over the Oregon staff going into this ballgame.
Yeah, I keep hearing, Joe, how Ohio State's defense hasn't faced anything close to this Oregon offense, but I flipped the script, and I see it the other way, that this Oregon defense hasn't faced anything close to this Ohio State offense, is the way I look at it as well. In the kicking game, the couple things that jump out at me, Joe, I don't think the Buckeyes want to put the game on the foot of Sean Nurenberger, who's 13 of 20. He's kicked better late in the season. He was perfect against Alabama and against Wisconsin as well, although I do think he missed a field goal possibly against Wisconsin. But anyway, Nurenberger, less than automatic at 13 out of 20. The other thing that comes to mind is Jalen Marshall couldn't get loose against the Tide. They had excellent punt coverage against him, but he faces not nearly as good a kicker in Alabama's J.K. Scott, in Oregon's Ian Wheeler, who averages 39 yards per punt. Jalen Marshall's a threat, returning the punts. Maybe the Buckeyes get him loose.
Yeah, great point. You mentioned it. You mentioned the breakdowns of special teams. Special teams are going to play a factor in this ball game. You look at Ohio State and you look at Oregon. Really didn't play close games where it came down to the kicking game. So both kickers inexperienced in big game spots. And more importantly, Mark, in these big games right now, you have to break tendency for both of these coaches. Which coach is going to break their tendency first to show a different wrinkle? Urban Meyer did it against Alabama with a reverse pass play to really confuse the tide. Player was in position, but credit the Ohio State receiver for making the play. But it was Urban Meyer's ability to adapt, make halftime adjustments, and that's going to be the key in this matchup. And special teams. Which team is going to break tendency and which team is going to make the special teams plays to put their team in a position? For me, I still like Ohio State's speed, and I like Ohio State's ability to really create disruption on the defensive front. And from a special teams perspective, I still give them a slight edge in the kick return game over Oregon at this point.
Then I also, when I match up bowl games, not necessarily these playoff and championship games, but when I try to match up these conference games in playing the bowl games, I see who have you beaten that I know that is quality, and are the losses bad losses, or are they decent, acceptable losses? And Oregon, of course, played that difficult Pac-12 schedule, and I'm lining up the games in my head right now, thinking about Utah and UCLA, Stanford, Florida State, of course, in the championship or in the playoff game, and the second game against Arizona and Michigan State, which was a really good game until about the 10-minute mark, and then Oregon ran away from Michigan State. Ohio State's schedule's been dogged the entire year, and now it looks a whole lot better than it did at one point. They, of course, now have beaten #1 Alabama. They trashed Wisconsin that turned around and beat Auburn in a bowl game. They outclassed Michigan State on the road, and then Michigan State turns around and beats a Baylor team that many considered one of the top 3 or 4 teams in the country. So I think we just have 2 extremely well-tested, battle-tested teams in this one.
Absolutely, and you can even take that Virginia Tech loss misleading, because when you look at Virginia Tech, 6-6 overall, entering their bowl game with Cincinnati, they got the victory in dominating fashion, but 5 of their losses, Mark, came by a total of 20 points. It's really 4 points per game. Virginia Tech, misleading loss by the Buckeyes, because everybody thought a 6-6 record, they were a mediocre team, not looking into the numbers that 5 of their 6 losses came by a total of 20 points, and you saw what they were able to do against a high-octane offense in Cincinnati. Defensively, one of the better teams in the nation entering that matchup against Cincinnati. That defensive front had 47 sacks on the year.
All right, Joe, you ready to pick this one?
I thought I gave my opinion a little bit early in the show. I really think that Ohio State, Mark, is playing consistent football, and they're playing as a team. I like their defensive front. I like Urban Meyer as a coach, and from what he's able to overcome, and that staff, what they're able to overcome this season, to me, shows mental resolve that you need in big ball games. I don't know how they'll do it, because when you look at the MO, I think that they really should slow down Oregon ball control type of attack, but they can win a high-scoring game too. It's just a matter of who's going to step up. To me, I like this team overall, and when I look at Oregon, I think their offense revolves solely around Marcus Mariota. And even though he's performed at an elite level, completing 68% of his passes and 38 touchdowns entering that game against Florida State, to me, they can take away Marcus Mariota and make them one-dimensional. And in my opinion, I think Ohio State can get the victory in convincing fashion if they do that.
All right, Joe, I'm going to study up a little bit more and take my shot later in the week. We appreciate the time, Joe. It's always a pleasure. Joe Lisi with us each and every week to break down the college football top 25 and break down the matchups, the personnel, and make his picks. And, of course, we've reached the end of the college football season with Oregon and Ohio State, and this should be a classic. All right, Joe, thanks so much for the time. We always appreciate it, man.
Always a pleasure, Mark. Can't wait.